Welcome to Somnia Lore, your place for peaceful, sleepy adventures. Subscribe to our channel, hit the bell icon.
He was not always the figure we imagine, with wild hair streaked by the wear of time and a mind sharper than any blade. Once he was simply a boy in a quiet house, where the nights hummed with stillness, and the stars outside his window seemed closer than the walls that confined him. It was in those nights that he first began to listen, not to the words of adults who moved through the house with hurried voices and tired sighs, but to the silence itself. The silence spoke in its own way, not with language, but with patience, with a rhythm that seemed to stretch like a thread between his small heart and the endless expanse above. He would lie awake, his blanket tucked around him, hearing the faint creak of the floorboards, the low hum of the refrigerator, and the gentle breathing of the universe outside. There was a mystery that lived in that house, one he could never quite name. A door at the end of the hallway, painted white, always closed, never opened. Sometimes, when the moonlight fell across its surface, he would swear he saw it glow faintly, as if something beyond it was alive and listening back. His parents never spoke of it. They passed by without notice, their eyes elsewhere, caught in the noise of ordinary life. But for him, it became a presence, something like a teacher, something like a friend. He never tried the knob. He never knocked. He simply waited night after night for the door to reveal its secret. And though it never did, it planted a seed in him. The idea that not every mystery is meant to be solved, but some are meant to shape you quietly, like a lullaby you half remember. He carried that silence with him, like a cloak. In school, he was not loud, not eager to prove himself in the ways other children were. He listened. He observed. His teachers often thought him absent-minded, his head tilted toward the window as though he were chasing clouds, but the truth was gentler than that. He was learning to hear the patterns beneath things, the way a bird hesitated before taking flight, the way a friend's laughter carried sadness hidden inside, the way adults repeated phrases not because they believed them, but because they were afraid of silence. These were lessons no book gave him, but they became the foundation of who he was. At times, his solitude worried those who loved him. His mother, soft-eyed and weary, would sit at the edge of his bed and ask if he was lonely. He never had the right words. How could he explain that loneliness did not feel like emptiness to him, but like a doorway, like that quiet white door at the end of the hall? He would smile instead, and she would kiss his forehead, satisfied by the gesture, though she did not understand. He wasn't hiding from the world. He was listening for something beyond it. There was one friend, though, who understood in her own way, a neighbor's daughter, not much older than him, who often found him sitting in the grass at twilight, staring up at the slow turning of the evening sky. She never asked why. Instead, she would sit beside him, sometimes humming a tune under her breath, soft and wordless. He didn't always understand her humming, just as she didn't always understand his silences, but somehow, together, they formed a language. He once told her about the door, in hushed tones, as if speaking of it too loudly would erase it. She listened, without disbelief, nodding slowly, as though she too knew that certain mysteries deserved reverence, not explanation. That companionship became a quiet anchor. With her presence, his silence became less like isolation and more like belonging. They would trade little treasures, a pressed flower, a folded note with a drawing, a sandwich cut unevenly, but shared as if it were a feast. Small, unremarkable things, but they carried the weight of rituals, grounding him in a world that often felt too loud, too fleeting. Years passed, and with them came the sharpening of his mind. He began to take apart radios, clocks, anything that ticked or hummed, not out of rebellion, but out of wonder. His room filled with pieces of machines, the smell of metal and dust and oil. He found that when he worked with his hands, his thoughts flowed more freely, as if building was another form of listening. But still, he carried the same patience, the same quiet awe for the mysteries he could not take apart. For every clock he dismantled, the white door at the end of the hall remained untouched, a reminder that not everything yields to inquiry. He began to sense that his gift was not in invention alone, but in perception. While others chased noise and recognition, he had learned the art of noticing, the way silence held its own answers, the way small acts of care could echo louder than any declaration. His neighbor friend grew alongside him, and though their paths began to diverge, she would sometimes return, and together they would sit in the grass, no longer children but not yet adults, humming and silent in equal measure. He didn't always understand her words anymore. Life was pulling her in new directions, but he still understood her heart, and that was enough. As he grew, the world asked more of him. Teachers pressed him toward science fairs, competitions, the clamor of achievement. He excelled, but never in the way they expected. His inventions were strange, soft, impractical things. A small device that captured the sound of rain so it could be replayed on sleepless nights. A lamp that dimmed in rhythm with a heartbeat. A clock that slowed time not in reality but in perception, offering the illusion of rest. People laughed, charmed but puzzled, unable to see the quiet genius hidden in those small kindnesses. He didn't mind. To him, they were gifts, acts of care disguised as machines. And yet, even as his hands built wonders, his mind often returned to that closed door of his childhood. He could still see it in memory, painted white, glowing faintly in the moonlight. He wondered if it was still there, waiting. Perhaps it had never been real. Perhaps it was only ever a metaphor, a shape his young mind invented to give form to the silence that raised him. But even then, he understood. It had shaped him, real or not. It had taught him to live with mystery, to honor the unanswered, to let curiosity coexist with patience. Lying awake at night, older now, he sometimes imagined opening it. What would be revealed? Another world? A voice? Or only more silence? The same silence that had always guided him. In those moments, he felt both the ache of not knowing and the peace of acceptance. Not all doors are meant to be crossed. Some are meant simply to remind us that there is always more beyond, and that the journey of listening never ends. The boy who once pressed his ear to the quiet of the universe was already becoming something larger than himself, though he did not yet know it. His story was unfolding, softly, patiently, one step at a time, like the stars he had watched as a child, distant yet familiar. His path was luminous not because of its brilliance, but because of the quiet constancy with which it glowed, and so his beginning was not marked by thunder or triumph, but by a door that stayed closed, a silence that taught him how to listen, and a heart that grew gentle in the space between. He often thought of that closed white door when life carried him forward, away from the stillness of childhood and into the restless corridors of growing older. The door had never opened, but in a way it had opened something within him, an ability to wait, to feel, to sense the weight of things that others overlooked. As he stepped into the world beyond his small house, he carried this with him, though he did not always realize it. The silence became less present in his days, filled now with voices, instructions, laughter, and questions. Yet, beneath all of that, the silence endured, woven like a hidden thread that kept his heart steady. Adolescence brought with it a strange restlessness. He was clever, sharper than most, but never driven by the same hungers that others chased. His classmates ran toward attention, trophies, and praise, but his joy was subtler. He found wonder in the unfinished, in the half-built, in things that seemed flawed, but alive. When he worked on machines, he preferred not to perfect them, but to leave them slightly open-ended, as if they might choose their own purpose later. A small device he once made did nothing more than flicker like fireflies when the room grew too quiet. To others, it was useless. To him, it was comfort, a way to remind himself that silence did not mean emptiness, but presence. And though he drifted apart from many, there were still moments of closeness. The neighbor girl, who had once sat in the grass with him, returned at intervals, her presence a reminder of continuity. She was changing, growing into herself, and with her came laughter, stories, and dreams he didn't always share but always listened to. Sometimes she would ask him questions about the strange machines scattered across his desk, not because she cared about their functions, but because she cared about him. He would try to explain, fumbling with words, yet what she truly heard was not the explanation, but the affection woven into the way he spoke. She didn't need the science. She understood the heart. Still, their lives began to separate in quiet ways. She sought the world with open arms, eager to meet people, to explore, to dance in spaces where he felt out of place. He loved her joy, but he could not follow it. When she told him once, with a soft laugh, that he carried silence like an old friend, he only nodded. She didn't mean it unkindly. In fact, he knew she admired it. Yet her words reminded him of something he was beginning to sense. His path would never look like the paths of others. It would be lonelier, stranger, though no less real. There were teachers who noticed the peculiar way his mind worked. One in particular, a man with greying hair and gentle eyes, saw in him something beyond academic brilliance. He never scolded him for daydreaming or dismantling school property to see how it functioned. Instead, he asked him questions like, "What do you hear when the world grows quiet?" The boy had no answer then, but he remembered the question, carried it with him like another unopened door. That teacher became less of an instructor and more of a silent mentor, not by filling him with facts, but by allowing his oddities to feel like strengths rather than flaws. At home, things were changing too. The warmth of his mother's voice grew rarer, her days swallowed by obligations he didn't fully understand. His father was often distant, preoccupied, present only in fragments. And so the boy leaned deeper into the companionship of silence, into the trust of his own perception. He knew the sound of rain better than the sound of his father's footsteps. He knew the gentle hum of the stars better than the rhythm of family dinners. Yet he did not resent it. Life simply was what it was, shaped by absences as much as by presences. Sometimes, late at night, when the house seemed impossibly large and he felt like a small figure adrift inside it, he would return to the memory of that white door. He pictured himself standing before it, not as a boy, but as the person he was slowly becoming. The image steadied him, reminded him that unanswered questions could be anchors rather than weights. That door was no longer something he feared or longed to open. It had become a symbol, a quiet teacher reminding him that not knowing was not the same as being lost. As the years unfolded, he began to use his strange inventions in ways that touched those around him, though they seldom understood the full meaning. Once, when the neighbor girl fell ill and could not sleep, he left by her bedside a tiny glass box that pulsed with a soft blue light, matching her breathing. It did nothing extraordinary, it simply kept her company in the night, its glow fading and brightening as if whispering, "You're not alone." She never forgot it. For her, it was more than a machine. It was proof of his quiet care. In another moment, when his teacher confessed that he missed the sound of his childhood river, long gone now, the boy constructed a small recorder that captured the flow of water from a nearby stream. He brought it to his teacher and said only, "It's not the same river. But maybe it will remind you." The man wept softly, touched not by the precision of the device, but by the heart behind it. Acts like these defined him more than any prize or recognition ever could. He was building a reputation without realizing it, not as the loudest or the brightest, but as the one who carried a different kind of wisdom. People did not always understand him, but they felt something when they were near him, a strange blend of calm and wonder, as though being in his presence slowed the world just enough to breathe more deeply. And yet, with each step toward maturity, he felt a weight pressing quietly upon him. It was not fear, exactly, nor sorrow, but an awareness of distance. He could connect, yes, but always in a way that seemed to live just beyond words. His silence was gift and barrier both. He loved deeply, but he struggled to express it in the ways others longed for. He listened, but seldom spoke. He cared, but often through gestures that others could not fully interpret. It made him at once treasured and misunderstood. One evening, sitting again in the grass where he and his childhood friend once shared twilight, he felt the ache of change most profoundly. She was there, beside him, humming again as she had years ago. The tune was softer now, tinged with maturity, but familiar. He wanted to tell her how much those moments had shaped him, how her presence had been as important as any lesson, as steady as the stars he so often watched. He wanted to say it all, but the words tangled inside him, caught in the silence he had made his home. Instead, he handed her a small notebook he had filled with sketches of the stars, each constellation traced with care. She looked at it, then at him, and smiled in a way that said she understood, even without his voice. That was the quiet power he carried forward, not the ability to dazzle, not the urge to conquer, but the capacity to love through silence, to offer presence without demand. And though the world would someday call him genius, traveler, inventor, even rebel he was at his heart, still that boy listening to the whispers of the universe in the stillness of his room, waiting patiently before a door that never opened. It was here, in the steady unfolding of adolescence, that his journey began to take its true shape. He was no longer only the listener. He was becoming the translator of silence, the one who could turn wordless wonder into acts of quiet care. And though he did not yet know it, these gentle beginnings would carry him far beyond the walls of his childhood home, far beyond the door, into realms where silence itself would become his greatest gift. The boy who had once built small, glowing boxes and listened to the hum of silence began to step further into the expanse of his own becoming. Adolescence had taught him that his gift was not only in invention, but in the way he could turn absence into presence, emptiness into quiet forms of care. Yet with each year that carried him forward, the world demanded more, and its demands were not gentle. His peers were already choosing their paths, careers, families, futures, drawn like maps across the horizon. He, meanwhile, lingered at the edges, his heart still tethered to mysteries that could not be explained in practical terms. He carried himself with a curious stillness, the kind that unsettled some and comforted others. In classrooms filled with noise and restless ambition, his silence seemed almost defiant. Yet it was not rebellion, it was listening, always listening. He could hear the tremor in a friend's laughter, the hesitation in a teacher's tone, the longing tucked inside the ordinary. It made him wise in ways that were hard to measure, but it also made him solitary. Few could meet him in that quiet place where he lived. There were evenings when he would return home, tired from the weight of other people's expectations, and sit again by the window where the stars watched over him. The house itself had changed, walls painted new colors, furniture rearranged, the faint traces of childhood fading. But in his memory, the white door still remained. Though it no longer stood physically before him, it lived within him, an inner threshold reminding him that the greatest mysteries were not always meant to be solved. He carried it like a secret companion, a symbol of patience and wonder. The friend from his childhood, the one who once hummed wordless songs beside him, remained in his orbit, though their paths crossed less often now. She moved through the world with an openness he admired but could not replicate. She spoke easily, laughed freely, embraced life with a readiness that seemed almost luminous. He loved her for it, not in the way of grand declarations, but in the way one loves a sunrise, quietly, reverently, knowing it cannot be held. Sometimes they would still meet, exchanging small tokens as they always had: a pressed flower, a star map drawn by his hand, a story she'd heard that made her think of him. Their bond was not loud, but it endured, like a thread woven through time. Yet even with these connections, he began to feel the pull of solitude more deeply. He wandered through libraries, filling notebooks with sketches and ideas that no one asked for. He built machines that whispered instead of shouted, devices that soothed rather than impressed. One evening, he created a clock that slowed its ticking when the room was filled with voices, as if urging those within it to rest, to listen more closely. People found it odd, unnecessary, but he knew its purpose. He was building not for applause, but for the quiet healing of hearts. It was during this time that he encountered someone new, a figure who would alter his path in a subtle but lasting way. An older man, not unlike the teacher who once asked him what he heard in silence. This man was a traveler, a wanderer, who seemed to carry the scent of distant roads in his clothes and the weight of unspoken stories in his eyes. They met by chance, or perhaps not by chance at all, in a quiet corner of the city where machines hummed and stars were dimmed by electric light. The man watched him tinker with a small device and asked softly, "Why do you build things that others call useless?" The boy paused, uncertain how to answer. Finally, he said, "Because they make silence easier to live with." The man nodded, as though this was exactly the answer he had been waiting for. He did not laugh, did not dismiss, but instead listened with the same patience the boy himself had carried for so long. In that moment, the boy felt something rare, recognition, as though someone had finally spoken the same language he had been whispering all his life. This mentor did not stay long. His path was that of a wanderer, but in the brief time they shared, he gave the boy something precious: permission. Permission to follow the quiet road, to trust the oddities of his heart, to believe that gentleness could be strength. He told him once, "Not every invention must dazzle. Some must comfort. Some must remind us that we are not alone." Those words rooted themselves in the boy's spirit, joining the memory of the white door, the humming songs of his friend, and the silence of his childhood nights. As he grew into young adulthood, the contrast between him and the world became sharper. Others rushed forward into careers, wealth, recognition. He drifted, not aimlessly, but attentively, waiting for the right shapes to emerge from the quiet. He did not envy those who surged ahead. He admired their certainty, but he trusted the patience that had guided him since boyhood. He was not made for speed or spectacle. He was made for depth, for slow unfolding, for the kind of discoveries that reveal themselves only when one listens long enough. There were moments of doubt, of course, nights when he wondered if he was falling behind, if his silence was not a gift but a flaw. He would sit with these thoughts, letting them ache within him, until the stars reminded him of their slow burning, their patience that spanned millennia. And he would breathe again, steadying himself in the rhythm of the universe. His inventions began to take on a new shape, not merely objects, but symbols. A lantern that dimmed not with time, but with the user's sighs, as though it could sense exhaustion and respond with tenderness. A book of blank pages that revealed faint constellations only when held under moonlight. A machine that captured the warmth of a hand and stored it, releasing it later into another's palm, as if passing on comfort through time. Each creation was strange, impractical by ordinary standards, but profoundly human in its essence. Those who encountered them were puzzled, sometimes amused, but always moved in ways they could not explain. They felt, if only for a moment, less alone. And though few understood the depth of his work, those who did, his friend, his mentor, A small handful of others recognized that he was shaping a legacy not of brilliance alone, but of quiet wonder. It was here, standing at the threshold between youth and adulthood, that he began to realize something. He was not merely listening to silence anymore. He was giving silence a voice, a form, a presence in the world. What had once been a private companion was becoming a gift he could share. And still, in the quiet corners of his mind, the image of the white door lingered. He thought of it less often now, but when it appeared in dreams or memory, it carried with it a sense of promise, as if it was waiting for him still, somewhere beyond, reminding him that the greatest mysteries are not solved in youth, nor even in maturity, but in the long arc of a life lived with patience and care. He did not yet know what awaited him in the years to come, the relationships that would deepen, the losses that would mark him, the wisdom that would slowly take root. But he knew this. He was walking his path, one step at a time, guided not by urgency, but by the soft light of wonder. And in that knowing, there was peace. The inventions that had once been scattered curiosities on his desk began to take on new weight as the seasons passed. They were no longer just experiments born from sleepless nights and quiet curiosity. They were becoming extensions of himself, fragments of his heart offered to the world in the only language he truly knew. Each device carried a piece of silence, a piece of wonder, a piece of the unseen tenderness that lived within him. And though few fully understood, there were enough who felt their quiet resonance to keep him going. Yet the more he gave, the more he began to notice a quiet ache beneath it all. For all his gifts, for all his listening, he often found it difficult to be understood in return. People would marvel at his strangeness, sometimes even admire it, but rarely did they see the boy still standing before that white door in his heart. He longed, not for recognition, but for a deeper connection, someone who could meet him in the silence, not merely observe it from afar. It was during this time of restless longing that his bond with his childhood friend shifted once again. She returned after a long absence, carrying stories of roads traveled, faces met, laughter shared. She was brighter now, her presence glowing with the kind of freedom that only comes from stepping into the wider world. He welcomed her back quietly, with the same steady warmth he had always given. And though their paths were diverging more than ever, there was still something unspoken between them, something that held even when words faltered. One evening, as they sat beneath the stars once more, she told him of a dream she had carried since childhood, a dream of seeing the world in all its colors, of leaving behind small towns and familiar streets to find something greater. He listened, his heart aching with both pride and sorrow. He wanted her to go, to grow, to become who she was meant to be. But he also felt the quiet sting of knowing that her journey might carry her further from him than ever before. He did not try to hold her back. Instead, he reached into his pocket and handed her a small device he had made in secret, a pendant that glowed faintly with shifting colors, each one tied to the sound of her heartbeat. "It doesn't do much," he said softly, almost apologetically, "but if you ever feel alone, it will remind you that someone is still listening." She held it in her hand, her eyes glistening, and for a moment the silence between them was filled with something larger than words. She pressed the pendant to her chest, then leaned closer and whispered, "You always find a way to say what others can't." That night, he watched her walk away, the glow of the pendant fading into the distance like a star carried off by the horizon. He knew their paths would cross again someday, but he also knew that a part of him had been given to her, carried into the world beyond his reach. And in that letting go, he began to understand something new about love, that it was not about possession, but about presence. To love, for him, was to give quietly, to let another carry a piece of his silence into their own journey. Her absence left him lonelier, yet also freer. He turned back to his work, to the quiet creations that filled his nights. But now they carried a different tone, not just comfort for himself, but gifts meant for others. A lantern that flickered with the warmth of a remembered touch. A set of chimes that played, not with the wind, but with the echoes of laughter once shared. A chair that rocked gently, as if cradling its occupant in invisible arms. They were strange, impractical things by the world's standards, but to him they were love made tangible. His mentor returned briefly during this period, the wanderer whose words had once granted him permission to trust his path. The man observed his latest inventions with a quiet smile, tracing his fingers over the delicate work. "You are learning," he said softly, "that invention is not only about shaping matter, but about shaping memory. What you build carries not just function, but feeling. And that in time will matter more than you know." The boy, though he was no longer quite a boy, took these words deeply into himself. They became another thread woven into his growing tapestry of wisdom. For he was beginning to see that his life was not simply a journey of creation, but a journey of translation. Translating silence into presence, translating absence into remembrance, translating longing into light. But with growth came challenges. The world was not always kind to strangeness. There were those who dismissed his work, who laughed at his odd devices, who told him to build something useful, something profitable, something that mattered in the eyes of society. Their voices stung, not because he believed them, but because part of him feared they might be right. There were nights when he sat in his room, surrounded by unfinished machines, and wondered if he was wasting his life on dreams that no one else could understand. In those moments of doubt, he often thought back to the door. The white door that had never opened, the door that taught him patience. It came to him now not as a mystery, but as reassurance. It whispered to him in dreams, "Not every answer is needed, not every path must be clear. Some doors remain closed because what they offer is not a solution, but a reminder." And with that, he would breathe again, steadying himself in the rhythm of his own heart. Slowly, his circle began to widen. A few souls, rare and precious, found meaning in his work. They did not always understand the mechanics, but they felt the intention. A child held one of his glowing stones and smiled for the first time in weeks. An old woman touched the chair that rocked with invisible arms and wept quietly, saying it felt like her husband was still near. These small moments became his true rewards, silent affirmations that his gifts, however odd, were reaching hearts in ways words could not. And though his journey was only beginning, he sensed that he was walking a path larger than himself. The silence that had shaped him was no longer his alone. It was flowing outward now into others, carried in the machines he built, the gestures he made, the memories he preserved. The boy who once pressed his ear against the quiet of the universe was slowly becoming a man whose silence spoke louder than any noise. Yet somewhere deep within, the ache of that closed door still lingered. It had not left him, it had simply changed. It was no longer a puzzle he longed to solve, but a companion he carried with him. And in carrying it, he began to realize that his life was less about finding answers, and more about embodying the questions themselves, the stars above, the silence within, the friendships that had shaped him, the inventions that grew from his hands. All were threads in a tapestry still being woven. He did not yet know what picture they would form, but he knew he must keep weaving. One quiet act, one strange invention, one moment of presence at a time. And so, as the seasons shifted once more, he continued forward, no longer just listening to the silence, but living as its voice. The seasons did not slow for him, nor did they wait for the doubts that sometimes pressed into his chest. Time carried him forward, and with it came both the weight of expectation and the faint glimmers of possibility that stretched further than he had ever imagined. His creations, once hidden in the corners of his room, had begun to slip into the world like quiet messengers. They traveled not through markets or grand displays, but from hand to hand, whispered from one heart to another, until stories of his devices began reaching places he had never stepped into. He did not seek recognition, but recognition began to seek him. Letters appeared at his door, written by strangers who had heard of the boy who built machines that could soothe grief or remind the lonely of warmth. Some were filled with gratitude, others with questions, and some simply carried silence in the form of a pressed flower or a small sketch, a language he understood better than words. And yet, with each letter, he felt the quiet tension between two worlds, the world of his inner silence, where he created with no thought of return, and the world of voices that demanded he define what he was doing, why he was doing it, and what it meant for others. It was during this time of quiet conflict that the door returned to him in a new way. For years it had been a still image in his mind, an unanswered question, but now it began to appear in dreams differently. Sometimes it was no longer shut, but trembling faintly, as if something on the other side was pressing against it. Other times he would see light spilling through the cracks, soft and golden, hinting that what was beyond was not emptiness, but something waiting for the right moment to emerge. These dreams unsettled him, for they suggested movement where once there had only been stillness. The door was no longer just a reminder of patience. It was becoming a signal of change. One night, as the dream door quivered before him, he felt compelled to place his hand upon it. When he did not push, nor did he demand it to open. Instead, he simply listened. What he heard was faint, like the echo of a heartbeat carried through walls, but it was enough to stir something deep inside him. He woke with the sense that his journey was entering a new chapter, one that would not only test his silence, but also ask him to share it in ways he had never dared before. The following weeks brought an unexpected invitation. A gathering was to be held in the city, a convergence of inventors, thinkers, and dreamers, where people from across lands came to present not only their creations, but also their philosophies. The boy, now grown into quiet youth, received a letter urging him to attend. It was not written with demand, but with curiosity. "We have heard whispers of your work. Come, if you are willing, and let us see what silence can create." He hesitated. The idea of standing among those who spoke loudly of progress and achievement unsettled him. He had never built for acclaim, never sought an audience. His machines were not trophies, but bridges, fragile and personal. Yet something within him whispered that this was necessary, not for validation, but for the sake of the path itself. He could not remain forever in the safety of solitude. Silence must sometimes step into the noise if it was to endure. And so, with trembling resolve, he set out for the city. The journey itself was unlike anything he had known. The quiet hills and forests that had shaped him gave way to crowded roads, bustling voices, and towers of stone and glass that seemed to touch the sky. He felt small among them, a wanderer carrying only a few of his creations carefully wrapped in cloth. People brushed past him, each carrying their own urgency, their own rhythm. For the first time, he wondered if his silence would be drowned here, lost beneath the sheer volume of the world. The hall where the gathering was held was vast and filled with brilliance of every kind. Some presented machines that could move mountains. Others unveiled devices that promised wealth, speed, or power. The air hummed with ambition, every voice straining to outshine the next. He listened quietly, not with judgment but with awe, though he could not help but feel his work was out of place. His lanterns of memory, his rocking chairs of comfort, his pendants of presence, what were they beside inventions that could alter the very structure of society? When his turn came, the silence in him trembled. He stepped forward, unremarkable among the bright-clothed speakers, his hands shaking slightly as he unwrapped his devices. The crowd looked on with polite interest, waiting to be dazzled. But he did not dazzle. He simply placed the lantern on the table, lit it, and let the faint glow pulse in time with the beating of his heart. He set the chimes to motion, and they played not with air, but with the resonance of his breath. He offered the pendant, explaining softly how it listened to its wearer and carried their rhythm as light. For a moment, the hall was restless. Some frowned, unimpressed, others whispered. But then, in the hush, between murmurs, something shifted. The old woman sitting in the front row lifted the pendant with trembling hands, and as it glowed with her pulse, she began to weep. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet grief of one who had carried absence too long. The crowd stilled. No explanation was needed. They felt it, not as spectacle, but as truth. What he offered that night was not progress as the world defined it, but presence. And presence, though subtle, had its own power. Not everyone understood, but enough did that the silence he carried spread, not as a shout, but as a whisper that lingered even after the hall emptied. The days that followed were filled with both challenge and possibility. Some criticized him, calling his work sentimental and impractical. Others approached him in secret, asking for lanterns, pendants, or chimes of their own. He realized then that silence does not always win in the open. Sometimes it must move quietly through the hidden spaces of human longing. But perhaps the most important thing that came from this journey was not the recognition of others, but his own recognition of himself. Standing in that hall, trembling yet unbroken, he had felt something shift inside. The door in his dreams no longer seemed distant. It was nearer now, almost ready. Not to reveal some grand answer, but to invite him to step through into the next mystery of his becoming. And so, as he returned from the city to the quiet landscapes of his home, he carried with him both doubt and strength. Doubt because the path ahead was still uncertain. Strength because he had faced the noise and remained true to his silence. He knew now that his journey was not only about building for others, but about becoming the kind of presence that could hold space for the unseen. The night he returned, he sat beneath the stars once more. The sky was vast, the silence familiar, but within it he heard something new. A soft echo, like footsteps approaching from beyond the door of his heart. He closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and whispered into the dark, "I am listening." And the silence, as always, answered. The stars that night lingered above him like listeners who had followed his journey in silence, patient and unyielding. Their watchfulness seemed to carry him into the next days, when the air around him felt heavier, as though something invisible pressed closer. The echoes of the gathering in the city had not faded. They had returned with him, not as loud voices, but as a soft current that stirred the stillness he once thought immovable. He found himself no longer just a boy who crafted in solitude. He was now, whether he had wished it or not, someone whose silence had touched others, and that touch had awakened something that would not rest easily. At first, it appeared only as subtle ripples. Travelers began arriving at his small home, guided not by maps but by word of mouth, seeking the comfort his creations carried. Some came with hope, others with grief, many with questions they could not form into words. He greeted them not as a master or a teacher, but simply as a presence, letting them sit with him in the quiet, watching as they held the lanterns or listened to the soft resonance of his chimes. For some, that was enough. For others, it was the beginning of something they could not name, but carried home with them like an unseen flame. Yet with the visitors came challenges too. Not everyone sought solace with pure intention. Some came with curiosity, but others came with hunger. Hunger for ownership, for control. They asked him to sell his designs, to produce them in great numbers, to transform his delicate silence into profit and power. He refused gently at first, then firmly, but with each refusal the tension grew. He began to realize that the more people knew of his work, the more it would be tested by forces that did not understand its nature. Silence, when met with greed, often became a battlefield of its own. And yet, in the midst of these new trials, he also began to encounter those who did not wish to take, but to give. One evening, as the sky deepened into a pale indigo, a young woman appeared at his door. She did not carry questions or demands, only a small gift, a woven scarf dyed with colors that resembled the twilight itself. She placed it in his hands and said softly, "I don't know why, but when I heard of your silence, I felt it calling me. I thought perhaps it might need warmth too." Her words lingered like an echo he could not forget. She stayed longer than the others, not as a guest, but as a companion. At first, they spoke little, their days filled with simple acts, tending to the small garden, repairing a broken chime, sitting together beneath the stars without needing to name what they saw. Over time, however, her presence began to weave itself into his. She understood something about him that others did not. He didn't always understand her words, but he understood her pauses, the way she looked at the horizon as though it carried answers just beyond reach. With her, silence was not something he had to defend. It was something shared, a bond that needed no explanation. But as his connection with her deepened, so too did the unease pressing at the edges of his life. The door in his dreams returned with increasing insistence. It no longer trembled faintly, it throbbed, pulsing with light as though urging him forward. Some nights he would wake drenched in sweat, certain that if he ignored it too long, something within him would break. Yet he feared what stepping through might mean. Would it take him away from all he had built, from the people who now sought him, from her? The young woman noticed his restlessness. One evening, as they sat by the lantern's glow, she touched his hand and asked softly, "What is it you hear when you close your eyes?" He hesitated, but her gaze held no judgment, only patience. And so for the first time he told her of the door, of how it had followed him since childhood, how it had shifted from a symbol of silence into a call he could not ignore. He admitted his fear that crossing it might undo everything, might even mean losing her. She listened without interruption, then simply said, "Perhaps the door is not asking you to leave us, but to bring us with you." Her words stayed with him, circling in his mind like the slow orbit of stars. He realized then that the journey ahead was not meant to be taken in isolation. Silence was not a wall but a bridge, and perhaps the door was not an ending but a threshold that required company. Still, the thought of stepping through filled him with both longing and dread. He knew the time was approaching when choice would no longer be deferred. As days turned into weeks, the visitors lessened, and a kind of stillness returned, though it was different from before. This was not the untouched silence of solitude, but a silence woven with others, marked by their presence and his own awakening. He and the young woman spent these quieter days crafting together. She wove while he built, and their works began to intertwine, lanterns wrapped in fabric, pendants tied with threads dyed like dusk. Each creation seemed to carry a part of their shared silence, a soft testimony of what two hearts could build in unison. But on the edge of these peaceful moments, a shadow gathered. Letters began arriving again, this time more insistent, more forceful. Powerful voices had heard of him, voices not content with whispers. They demanded his presence, his inventions, his secrets. They promised wealth, influence, recognition. When he ignored them, they warned. When he remained silent, they threatened. He knew then that silence alone would not protect him forever. It was during one such night, heavy with unease, that he dreamt of the door again. But this time he was not alone before it. She was there beside him, her hand resting lightly on his. The door shone brighter than ever, light spilling like water through its cracks, and for the first time he felt less fear. Together they stood before it, and though it remained unopened, he sensed that the moment was near. The dream ended not with the doors opening, but with her whisper in the dark. "When it calls, we will answer." When he awoke, her words echoed like a vow. He understood then that the journey was no longer his alone, nor was it about inventions or recognition. It was about carrying silence into the unknown, about trusting that what waited beyond the door was not destruction, but continuation. He did not know when the moment would come, but he knew it would, and when it did, he would not face it alone. For now, he rose from his bed, walked to the window, and looked out at the horizon. The stars were dimming, the first hints of dawn brushing the sky with pale gold. The world was changing, and so was he. With a quiet breath, he whispered into the fading night, "I am ready to listen." And in the stillness that followed, the silence seemed to answer, carrying him forward into what awaited next. The morning that followed carried a weight he could not name. The pale gold on the horizon stretched wide and fragile, as though the world itself was waiting for his next step. He felt it in the way the air pressed against his chest, in the way the silence outside seemed to hum with something more than quiet. The young woman noticed it too. She did not speak of it, but in her gaze there was an understanding that what they had been weaving together was drawing them toward something larger, something they could not yet see but could no longer avoid. He spent the early hours in the workshop, his hands moving slowly, not toward invention but toward reflection. The lanterns and pendants lay in soft rows, each carrying traces of those who had come to him. He touched them one by one, remembering faces, voices, silences shared. Each piece seemed to whisper back to him, reminding him that his journey was not isolated but carried within the quiet hearts of many. He had thought himself alone once, but now he realized he was carrying an invisible thread that connected lives far beyond his own. As the day passed, travelers returned, though fewer than before. Some came simply to sit, others to ask questions, some to leave behind fragments of themselves. An old man left a journal filled with unfinished letters he had never been brave enough to send. A child brought a broken toy and asked if it could be given a new song. A mother placed a lock of hair in one of the lanterns and asked only that it remember her child's laugh. He accepted each offering with tenderness, knowing that what he built was less invention and more remembrance, less utility and more presence. The young woman worked beside him, her weaving growing more intricate, as though her hands were following patterns she could not see. Often she hummed softly as she worked, a tune that had no words but lingered long after the sound faded. At first, he thought it was simply a habit, but over time he realized it was a kind of anchor, something that steadied them both when the air grew too heavy with waiting. And then one evening, the silence shifted again. They were sitting beneath the stars when a new sound cut through the stillness. It was faint, almost imagined at first, a low hum, steady and pulsing, as though the earth itself were breathing. He looked at her, and she looked back, both knowing it was not from the world they knew. The hum grew stronger with each passing night, seeping into dreams, into thoughts, into the space between heartbeats. He began to feel it inside him, resonating with the door that haunted his sleep. The door in his dreams grew brighter. Where once it pulsed faintly, it now glowed with an intensity that made his chest ache. He dreamt not only of standing before it, but of reaching toward it, his hand trembling with anticipation and fear. Each time he woke, the hum lingered in his bones, reminding him that the moment was drawing closer. He no longer doubted the door would open. The question was not if, but when, and what he would need to carry with him when it did. The visitors began to speak of strange things too. They described hearing whispers at night, of lanterns glowing on their own, of dreams that seemed to lead them to places they had never seen, but recognized in their hearts. Some said they saw the boy, the man now, standing at the edge of their vision, guiding them through shadows. He did not tell them of his own dreams, but he knew their stories were threads of the same tapestry. The silence he carried was no longer his alone. It was spilling outward, touching others in ways even he did not fully understand. Yet not all who came were gentle. One evening men arrived, cloaked not in kindness but in ambition. They demanded he show them the source of his power, that he teach them how to bend silence into control. Their voices were sharp, cutting against the stillness, their eyes hungry. He felt the familiar ache of fear, but stood firm. He told them that silence could not be owned, could not be mastered as they wished. It was not a weapon, nor a tool for power. It was a presence, and presence belonged to everyone. The men left, but not without warning. He knew then that danger was near, that the world would not leave him untouched much longer. But when he looked at the young woman beside him, at the scarf she had woven, and the lanterns they had filled together, he felt a calmness settle within him. The door was waiting, yes, but perhaps it was waiting because the world was not yet ready, because he still had work to do here. In the nights that followed, his dreams became more vivid. He no longer stood before the door in silence. He began to hear voices on the other side. Some were familiar, echoes of those who had visited him. Others were strange, unknown yet hauntingly close, as if they belonged to lives he had not yet lived. The light beneath the door grew brighter, spilling across his dreamscape, illuminating paths that wound into infinity. Each night he woke with the sense that time was thinning, that the space between what was and what was coming was narrowing one dawn. As the horizon blushed faintly, the young woman placed her hand on his and said, "The door will not wait much longer. But when it opens, it will not just be for you. It will be for all of us." He looked into her eyes and saw the truth there. She had known this long before he had admitted it to himself. And for the first time he felt less afraid. The journey was no longer his burden to carry alone. It was theirs, woven into every silence they had shared, every lantern they had lit, every dream they had breathed into being. That evening, as they sat beneath the stars, the hum beneath the earth grew stronger, resonating with the rhythm of their hearts. He closed his eyes and whispered once more, "I am listening." And this time, he felt not only the silence answer, but the world itself, as though everything around him was leaning closer, waiting for the moment when the door would finally open. The hum beneath the earth did not fade with the passing nights. Instead, it deepened, a low and steady rhythm that felt less like sound and more like a pulse, a heartbeat that belonged not to him, not to her, but to something vaster than either of them could grasp. At first, it unsettled him, but over time he realized it was not a warning, but an invitation, as if the world itself was preparing them for the threshold they had long sensed, but never named aloud. The young woman noticed it too, though she bore it with quiet steadiness. Sometimes she would pause in her weaving, tilting her head as though listening to a music too delicate for ordinary ears. "It's growing stronger," she would murmur, and he would nod, though neither of them dared to ask aloud when the strength would crest, when the hum would no longer be content to remain beneath their feet. Visitors still came, though their faces were different now. Many were drawn, not by rumor but by dream. They arrived speaking of visions that carried them to his home, of lanterns glowing in their sleep, of chimes ringing where no chimes had been. Some came from faraway lands, claiming that the silence itself had guided them across oceans and deserts. He received them with the same tenderness as before, though part of him knew this was no longer coincidence. The silence was gathering, pulling threads together, weaving a tapestry beyond his understanding. One evening, a young traveller arrived who spoke with urgency. He said he had seen the door too, not in waking life, but in dreams that had returned night after night. The traveller described it exactly as he knew it, the trembling frame, the golden cracks of light, the steady pull that made sleep feel like standing at a threshold. Hearing his vision spoken aloud by another sent a shiver through him. It was no longer his private mystery. The door was reaching outward, calling to others as well. This realization brought both comfort and unease. Comfort, because he was no longer alone in his burden. Unease, because if others were being summoned, then the moment was nearer than he dared to admit. He shared this with the young woman as they sat beneath the stars, their hands folded together. She listened, then said softly, "If the door calls more than one, then perhaps it will not open for a single soul, but for all who are ready." Her voice carried no fear, only a quiet certainty that steadied him more than any explanation could. But not everyone who came was prepared for the silence. Some grew restless in its presence, agitated by what they could not control. A few demanded answers, pressing him to reveal what lay beyond the door, as though he had the knowledge they lacked. He told them the truth, that he did not know, that he was only listening, waiting, preparing. But the honesty angered some. They wanted certainty, promises, power. They left frustrated, carrying with them a dissonance that lingered like a shadow after sunset. In the days that followed, the hum began to change. It no longer belonged only to the earth. It resonated in the air, in the timbre of voices, in the quiet between breaths. Even the lanterns seemed to flicker in time with it, their glow shifting as though attuned to something unseen. He found himself pausing mid-task, simply to place his hand on the ground and feel the steady pulse echo through his bones. The young woman often joined him, and together they sat with it, not speaking, allowing the resonance to wash through them. It was during one such moment of listening that she whispered, "Do you feel it? It's not just calling. It's teaching us how to walk toward it." He realized then that the hum was not only a signal, but a guide, preparing their hearts for the passage ahead. Silence was no longer only stillness. It had become movement, drawing them step by step closer to the threshold. The dreams grew heavier. Night after night, he stood before the door, the light spilling wider, the voices beyond clearer. Sometimes he thought he heard laughter, sometimes weeping, sometimes only the steady rhythm of countless heartbeats blending into one. Each time he reached for the door, he woke before his hand could touch it, the yearning sharp enough to ache. He began to carry that ache into his waking hours, walking through his days with the sense that he was standing in two worlds at once. One beneath the stars, one before the door. The young woman, too, began to dream. She told him of seeing not only the door, but the path leading to it, a winding passage lined with lanterns, each one carrying a fragment of a soul they had touched. She said she recognized faces in the light, faces of visitors, travelers, strangers who had found comfort in his silence. "It isn't only ours," she told him. "The door belongs to everyone who has listened, everyone who has carried silence into their lives." Her words wrapped around him like the twilight scarf she had once given him, steady and sure. But as their bond with the silence deepened, so too did the resistance outside. Word of his growing influence reached those who valued control over presence. Rumors spread of powerful men who plotted to claim him, to harness the hum for their own ends. He sensed their approach long before they arrived, as though the silence itself warned him. And yet he did not run. He could not. To flee would be to betray the very heart of what he had been building. One night, beneath a moon bright enough to cast shadows sharp upon the ground, they came, a small group, cloaked and silent, their eyes gleaming with intent. They demanded again what he had refused to give, the secret of the door, the source of the silence, the power they believed he commanded. He told them what he had always known, that there was no secret, no power, no ownership. Silence could not be stolen. It could only be entered. They did not believe him. They threatened, pressed closer, but the young woman stepped forward, her presence unwavering. She said nothing, but the stillness she carried was enough to push them back, unsettled by what they could not name. They left with anger in their footsteps, but he and the young woman remained. He turned to her then and realized that what they carried together was stronger than any threat. The silence had grown into something untouchable, something beyond possession. It was a living presence, shared, woven, waiting. That night, as they sat together, the hum rose louder than ever before, filling the air until it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. He closed his eyes and once more whispered the vow that had carried him this far. I am listening. And for the first time, he felt the door stir, not in dream but in waking life, as though the boundary between worlds had thinned to a veil no thicker than a sigh. The stars above shimmered with an intensity that made the sky tremble. The ground beneath their feet pulsed with a rhythm that matched their own hearts. He knew then that the threshold was no longer distant. The door was not simply waiting, it was beginning to open. The night did not return to stillness after the stirring of the door. The air itself had shifted, carrying with it a resonance that could no longer be mistaken for dream or imagination. It pressed gently against the skin, hummed faintly within the bones, and whispered through the lantern flames that now burned with an intensity unlike before. Every breath seemed laced with the presence of something vast and imminent, as though the unseen threshold was no longer distant, but standing invisibly among them. He walked through the hours after in quiet, unable to sleep, his steps tracing familiar paths that no longer felt the same. The young woman stayed close, her silence steady but her gaze sharp, as though she too sensed that their lives had crossed into a moment that could never be reversed. Neither spoke of fear. What they felt was something deeper, an awareness that what had long lingered just beyond the veil was preparing to emerge. The following morning, when travelers began to gather, they noticed it as well. Some spoke of strange dreams, others of waking to find themselves standing outside without memory of how they had left their beds. A few said they heard voices calling from the direction of his home, though no words could be understood, only the pull. No one seemed surprised that they had come, as if the decision had been made for them before their minds could catch up. He welcomed them as always, but this time his heart trembled with recognition. The silence was no longer his to hold alone. It was summoning its own congregation. At dusk, the sky burned in hues of deep crimson, and the lanterns lit themselves before hands could reach them. Their flames leaned, not with the wind, but with the rhythm of the hum, swaying in unison, a silent chorus of light. He and the young woman stood among them, surrounded by those who had gathered, and though no one spoke, every soul present felt it. The door was drawing nearer. That night, the dream did not come as it once had. He did not find himself before the closed frame, reaching toward light just beyond touch. Instead, he was already inside. The world within the door unfolded around him, vast and endless, filled with rivers of light that moved like living water. He heard voices, not as whispers this time, but as songs woven of countless tones, blending into a harmony that carried no beginning and no end. The air shimmered with a radiance that did not blind but revealed, as if every particle held the memory of creation itself. Yet the most striking thing was the presence. It was not a figure, not a face, but an immense awareness pressing against him from all sides. It carried no judgment, no command, only an embrace so complete that he felt himself dissolving into it, losing the boundary between self and everything. For a moment, he did not know if he was dreaming or if the dream had dissolved into reality, pulling him into a place that had always been waiting. When he woke, the young woman's hand was already on his chest, steadying him as though she too had felt the weight of the vision. Her eyes shone with quiet certainty, and she whispered, "It's opening for you." He shook his head, not from denial, but because he knew it was not only for him. She too had walked the path. Others had been called. The silence was not choosing one, it was preparing all who were willing to listen. The following days blurred into one another as the hum grew ever stronger. It was no longer a sound beneath the earth or a pulse within the stars. It was everywhere, woven into each breath, each heartbeat. Even the restless who once resisted the silence began to soften in its presence, their anger dissolving into awe they could not fight. Children laughed more easily. Strangers who arrived from distant places wept without knowing why, claiming they felt lighter than when they left their homes. The silence was reshaping them, drawing out what had always been hidden beneath noise and fear. But with this growing presence came a new weight. He began to feel the strain of carrying so much attention, so many questions, so many souls who looked to him as though he held the key to what lay beyond. Each day, more travelers arrived, speaking of dreams and visions, of lanterns burning in the corners of their sleep. They asked when the door would open, what awaited them, how they should prepare. He wanted to answer, but the truth was the same as it had always been. He did not know. The young woman saw the burden pressing on him and took his hand one evening, guiding him away from the crowd. "You don't have to hold the door for them," she said softly. "The silence isn't yours to give. It's theirs to step into when they're ready." Her words struck him like a bell, ringing through the night, clarifying what he had begun to forget. He was not a gatekeeper. He was only a witness, a listener, a companion at the threshold. The door belonged to all who were called. That realization steadied him, and in the nights that followed, he returned to the vow he had spoken again and again. "I am listening." It became his anchor, a reminder that his task was not to explain or to lead, but simply to remain present. And as he listened, the silence responded, growing clearer, fuller, until it was no longer only a presence around him, but a presence within him. One night, as the lanterns flickered in a windless sky, the hum shifted. It no longer pulsed in rhythm, but swelled, rising and falling like the tide. The gathered travelers gasped, some falling to their knees as the ground beneath them vibrated with a force that was neither earthquake nor storm, but something altogether different. The young woman turned to him, her face calm, but her eyes bright, with the knowing of what was to come. The stars above bent slightly, their positions shifting as though rearranging themselves into a pattern unseen for centuries. The lanterns flared, their flames stretching upward in a column of light that pierced the sky. In that moment he felt the veil thin beyond denial. The door was no longer a vision, no longer a dream. It was here, pressing against the world, waiting for the first soul to take the step that would carry them through. And as the silence swelled to fill every corner of their being, he realized that the choice was approaching swiftly, a choice not of whether the door would open, but of who would be willing to walk into the unknown and what it would mean for those left standing in the light. The night did not end. It folded into itself, timeless, endless, as if the door had already cracked wide enough to spill eternity into the present. He held the young woman's hand tightly, feeling her pulse in rhythm with his own, and whispered the words once more, though this time he was certain the door heard him not as a plea but as an answer. "I am listening." And the silence replied, not in words, but in the undeniable certainty that the threshold was no longer waiting. It was opening. The air around them no longer carried the hush of anticipation, but the weight of arrival. The silence had thickened into something nearly tangible, a veil brushing against their skin, stirring the lantern flames until they leaned toward the unseen threshold. No one needed to speak. Every heart in that gathering understood that the moment they had been circling for so long had arrived. It was not announced, it was not declared, it was simply here, the way dawn arrives without asking permission from the night. He stood at the center of the circle, the young woman by his side, and for the first time he felt no distance between himself and those who had gathered. They were bound now by the same hum that coursed through the air, their breaths sinking to the rhythm of something larger than them all. Eyes turned toward him, not with expectation of answers, but with recognition, as though each soul present had finally accepted what he had whispered to himself countless times. He was only listening. They all were. The ground pulsed beneath their feet, not with violence, but with a steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of the earth. The stars above continued their slow rearrangement, shimmering into constellations no one had seen before, patterns that stirred half-remembered dreams. In the distance, trees bent without wind, leaning toward the invisible opening, their leaves quivering in the presence of something eternal. Every living thing seemed to acknowledge it. Even the smallest insects fell still, as though nature itself had chosen to pause for what was unfolding. And then it began. The air in front of them shimmered, folding inward upon itself like water, rippling from a drop. What appeared was not a door, as his dreams had shown, no frame or threshold marked by wood or stone. Instead, it was a curve of light, bending into a shape that suggested an opening while refusing to define it. It was as if the silence had chosen to present not a gate to be crossed, but a question to be answered. The first to move was not him, but a child who had come with her family from a distant village. She stepped forward without fear, her small hands reaching toward the ripple of light. Her parents tried to hold her back, but the young woman raised her hand gently, urging them to let the child go. The girl's fingers brushed the surface, and for a heartbeat she vanished into radiance. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but before panic could take hold, the light released her. She turned back, her face alight with a serenity too deep for her years, and whispered, "It's not dark in there."
"It feels like being remembered." Those words loosened something in everyone's chest.
What had once been a mystery carried in whispers now became an invitation. The silence was not demanding, not threatening, it was welcoming. Yet no one rushed. The moment was too sacred, too vast for haste. They waited, each person feeling the call in their own time, some trembling, some weeping, some standing motionless, as though anchored by awe. He felt the pull more strongly than ever, not as pressure, but as belonging. The door was no longer outside of him. It resonated from within, calling him by the threads of every memory, every breath, every kindness he had carried. He looked to the young woman beside him and saw in her eyes the same reflection. Neither of them spoke, for words would have only diminished the purity of what they both understood. The silence was asking nothing more than their presence. Yet he hesitated, not from fear of what lay beyond, but from the awareness of those who still needed him here. The people gathered looked to him with reverence, yes, but also with trust. He could not abandon them without knowing whether his step would open or close the path for others. His heart ached with the weight of choice. The young woman touched his arm gently, grounding him.
"You've already opened the way," she whispered. "It isn't about who goes first.
It's about whether you go at all." Her words cut through his hesitation, reminding him of the vow he had spoken so many times. He was not a keeper of the silence. He was only a listener. To listen now meant to step where the silence beckoned. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, letting the hum fill him until he felt no distinction between his heart and the rhythm of the earth beneath. When he opened them again, the light before him seemed less like a barrier and more like a reflection, showing him not where he was going, but what he had always carried within. He took a step forward, his hand outstretched, and the young woman's hand followed into his. Together, they touched the veil. The sensation was not of crossing into another place, but of dissolving into something already present. The air grew weightless, the hum expanded into a chorus of infinite voices, and his vision filled with rivers of light winding into horizons beyond comprehension. He did not vanish. He was expanded, stretched into a space that did not recognize boundaries. He could feel every heartbeat of those around him, every breath of the ones who waited, every echo of the ancestors who had walked before. It was not another world, it was the hidden depth of this one. Time ceased to matter.
Moments folded into eternity, and eternity folded back into moments.
He saw his childhood self, the boy who sat in silence, weaving patterns from the stillness. He saw the faces of those he had loved, even the ones he had lost, glowing with a gentleness that told him loss had never truly been separation. He saw the young woman beside him, not as she was now, but as she had always been, part of the same song, the same silence, woven into his existence long before they had met. And through it all, the silence spoke, not in words, but in knowing. It reminded him that every step of his journey, every moment of solitude, every flicker of doubt had been preparing him for this, to realize that the silence was not outside of him, not a door to cross, but the core of his being. The door had never been locked. It had always been open, waiting for him to see. When at last he returned to himself, standing once more among the gathered, he did not speak. He did not need to. The light still shimmered before them, and those who had seen him step into it now knew they could as well. Some would choose tonight.
Others would wait.
But the silence had shown itself, and nothing would ever be the same. He looked at the young woman, her face serene, her eyes alight with the reflection of the veil. She smiled softly, and in that smile was the understanding that their path forward would not be marked by departure or arrival, but by presence, by listening. Together they turned back to the crowd, not as leaders, not as guides, but as companions on the threshold of something infinite. The night deepened, yet no one felt weary. Time moved differently in the glow of the silence, and though the stars wheeled above, no one counted the hours. The opening remained, patient and unwavering, like a heartbeat that would not falter. And in the stillness that followed, he felt a truth settle into him like a seed taking root. The journey was not about reaching the door, but about learning to live with it always open, always listening. The glow from the opening lingered in the night like a second moon, steady and unblinking, a reminder that the boundary between worlds had been thinned beyond return.
No one spoke loudly, as though words themselves might fracture the delicate stillness that had descended.
Families sat together in clusters around the lanterns, their faces lit with a quiet awe, while children leaned against their parents, too entranced to drift into sleep. The young woman remained at his side, her hand never fully leaving his, as though anchoring him to both the world behind and the one unfolding ahead. He noticed how the people's eyes shifted. Before, they had looked to him with questions, desperate for guidance, for reassurance, for certainty. Now, after seeing him touch the veil and return, their gazes softened into something else entirely. Not dependence, but recognition. It was as though they understood, finally, that the silence did not belong to him alone. The door was not his gift to grant, nor his burden to carry. It was theirs, all of theirs, waiting patiently for each soul to hear its invitation in their own time. The little girl who had stepped forward first played in the grass nearby, her laughter faint but clear. Every now and then she would glance at the light with the serenity of someone who had touched a mystery too vast to fear. Her parents watched her with tears in their eyes, no longer pulling her back, no longer trying to hush her boldness. In her innocence, she had revealed something even the oldest among them had forgotten: that the silence was not a threat, but a homecoming. He felt the weight of his earlier hesitation lift. For so long, he had feared that stepping through would make him vanish, would leave the people behind without the presence they seemed to need. Yet here they were, not diminished, but expanded, as though his crossing had unlocked something dormant within them. It was not his journey they had witnessed, but a mirror of their own. As the night deepened, the air thickened with a sense of expectancy. The veil did not waver. It pulsed faintly alive with light, neither pressing nor withdrawing. One of the travellers, an old man whose back was bent with years, stood slowly. His hands trembled as he stepped forward, but his gaze was steady. He did not look to anyone for permission, not even to him. He simply walked to the opening, raised his palm, and pressed it gently against the curve of radiance. His body shimmered as though outlined by starlight, and then, with a sigh that seemed to carry decades of weight, he disappeared into the glow. This time there was no gasp of fear,
Only stillness.
A few wept softly, not out of grief but of recognition. Minutes passed, and the old man did not return. The people shifted, glancing at one another, uncertain if the silence had kept him. Yet in their hearts they already knew. He had gone where the silence had always been leading him. The threshold was not merely a vision, it was a passage. The young woman leaned toward him and whispered, "Not all will return." Her voice carried no sorrow, only truth. He nodded slowly, feeling the weight of that understanding settle deep within him. This was not a door to be crossed lightly. It was not a spectacle to be watched, nor a trick to be explained. It was a choice, a surrender, and with each choice came a new shape of legacy. The people did not rush forward after the old man. The silence had no urgency, and neither did they. Instead, they settled into the rhythm of waiting, knowing that their time, too, would come. Some stared at the opening with longing, others with hesitation, still others with peace. But none turned away. Even those who did not step closer seemed to understand that their lives had already been touched, forever altered by its presence. As dawn approached, the veil did not fade. Its light dimmed only slightly, blending with the pale hues of morning, as though it intended to remain not as a fleeting vision, but as part of the world itself. Birds sang cautiously, their melodies weaving with the hum that still vibrated in the air. For the first time, he realized the silence was not separate from sound. It embraced it, held it, carried it. The chirping of wings, the rustle of leaves, even the quiet breaths of those gathered, all became part of its endless chorus. In the soft glow of day, he felt himself drawn to reflection. He thought of his childhood, the long hours spent listening to stillness, wondering why he felt different from those around him. He remembered the ache of loneliness, the unanswered questions, the nights where silence felt more like a burden than a gift. Now standing before the veil, he understood the silence had never been empty. It had been guiding him here, shaping him into one who could listen deeply enough to hear what others could not. The young woman seemed to sense his thoughts.
"You were never meant to carry it alone," she said gently.
"But if you hadn't, no one would have known how to hear it." Her words reached into him like roots, steady and grounding, and he realized she was right. His solitude had not been wasted, it had been a bridge, and now that bridge no longer belonged to him, because the silence itself had stepped forward to meet them. As the sun climbed higher, travelers began to stir. Some left, returning to their homes, though they carried a new light in their eyes. Others remained, unable to step away from the opening, as though afraid the moment would vanish if they turned their backs. Yet, whether they stayed or departed, he could see it clearly. The silence had etched itself into them. Even in distance, they would carry it, like an echo that would never fade. That night, as stars returned to the sky, the veil pulsed once more, brighter than before, as if responding to the shifting of hearts. He sat among the people, no longer apart from them, no longer burdened by the belief that the silence demanded his solitary devotion. For the first time, he felt part of a shared listening, a chorus of souls attuned to the same mysterious rhythm, and in that unity he sensed something even deeper. The silence was not only about crossing thresholds or touching mysteries beyond. It was about learning to live differently in the world they already inhabited, to see each moment, each connection, each breath as part of the same endless song. The door had opened, yes, but the greater gift was not escape. It was presence. He closed his eyes, breathed in the night, and whispered his vow once more. Only this time, it was not just his voice, it was the echo of many, layered and gentle, carrying the words into the starlit air. Together, they whispered, "We are listening," and the silence answered,
wrapping them all in its infinite embrace. The whisper of many voices still lingered in the air.
a shared vow carried on the night breeze, dissolving into the stars above. For a long while no one moved, as if even the act of shifting could shatter the fragile harmony they had found together. The silence cradled them all, not as something foreign or unreachable, but as a presence that dwelled within and around them, a companion older than memory itself. It was no longer something they feared. It was no longer something that belonged only to him. It was theirs, alive in every heartbeat, every breath, every gaze exchanged in quiet understanding. The veil remained, steady as ever, pulsing with a light that seemed to breathe in rhythm with the earth. Its glow softened the darkness, painting the grass with silver, brushing their faces with warmth, and though the night deepened, it did not recede. Its permanence was undeniable now. What had once been fleeting, a glimpse, a vision, a question, was now as real and constant as the moon above. The silence had chosen to stay, and yet, within that permanence, something stirred. He felt it first, a pull deep within, not urging him forward nor pressing him back, but inviting him to listen closer. It was different from before, less like a call across a distance, and more like a hand resting gently on his shoulder. He turned his gaze toward the opening, and for a brief moment it seemed to widen, not outward into brilliance, but inward, drawing him deeper into the stillness it concealed. The young woman noticed his expression and leaned closer. "It wants to show you more," she whispered, her voice barely a thread. He nodded, not questioning how she knew, for he had begun to understand that the silence spoke to them all differently. Sometimes through soundless words, sometimes through memory, sometimes through the simple act of standing together without speaking. He rose slowly, and the people parted without being asked. There was no fear in their faces now, only quiet reverence. The little girl who had once touched the veil watched with calm eyes, as if she understood more than her years allowed. The air thickened as he approached, his every step accompanied by the soft hum that rose and fell like an unseen tide. When he reached the opening, he paused, his hand hovering above its glow. He remembered the old man who had gone before and not returned, remembered the weight of that choice, remembered the acceptance in the people's silence. This time he did not reach outward. Instead, he simply stood, breathing with it, letting its pulse match his own, and then, like a vision behind closed eyes, it began. Not an image, not a voice, but a memory woven into the air itself. He saw the land before them as it once had been, untouched, vast, alive with waters and forests, carrying its own hum of silence before human feet ever pressed into its soil. He saw generations walking across it, carrying stories in their chests, guided always by something unseen yet ever present. He saw the moments where the silence was forgotten, drowned beneath the noise of fear and desire, and he felt the ache of its absence. The way it waited patiently, never retreating, always ready to return. The vision shifted, and he saw their gathering by the veil, saw himself among them, not as leader but as one thread in a fabric too wide to measure. He understood then that the silence was not bound to this place alone. The veil was not the silence itself, but a doorway, one of many, scattered like hidden seeds across the world. Others would find their own doors in their own time, drawn by their own listening, and just as his people had, they too would learn that the silence was not an end, but a beginning. He staggered slightly as the vision faded, the glow before him softening back into its steady rhythm. The young woman was there, her hand catching his arm before he could falter. Her eyes searched his face, and in them he saw no question, only certainty. She had felt it too. Perhaps not the same vision, but something of its truth had touched her as well. He turned back to the people, their eyes reflecting the veil's light. His voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. "It isn't just for us," he said, the words falling like gentle rain. "The silence is everywhere. Others will find it just as we did. We are not alone in this listening." A murmur rippled through them, not of doubt, but of awe. For the first time, they understood their place not as the end of a journey, but as part of a vast unfolding. The silence was larger than their gathering, larger than their fears, larger even than the veil itself. They were not chosen above others. They were simply the first to remember. Night drifted into dawn once more, and with it came a strange stillness, heavier than before, yet threaded with peace. Some among them began to speak quietly of leaving, of returning to their homes, of carrying what they had learned into the world. Others could not bear to step away, choosing instead to remain near the veil, content to live in its presence until their time came to cross. Neither choice was seen as right or wrong. Both were part of the same listening. Days passed, and a rhythm formed. The people built small shelters near the opening, not as fortresses, but as resting places woven from wood and cloth, open to the wind and sky. They shared food, they shared stories, they shared long silences by the veil, each moment teaching them more about patience, about humility, about the unspoken language of stillness. Life did not end at the threshold, it expanded around it. Yet he could not ignore the subtle changes. Each night, as the stars burned overhead, the veil pulsed brighter, as if fed by their presence, their listening, their willingness to dwell in its embrace. It was no longer a door waiting to be opened. It was alive, responsive, aware, and though it brought peace, he could feel something else stirring in its depths, something vast, something that hinted at truths they were not yet ready to see. One evening, as shadows stretched long and the air was heavy with approaching rain, the little girl came to him again. Her small hand slipped into his, and she whispered, "It wants us to remember more." Her words carried the weight of certainty, as though she were repeating something spoken directly into her heart. He looked at her and saw in her gaze the same light that shimmered in the veil, a reflection of something timeless. He knew then that their journey had only begun. What they had found was not an answer but a path, and the silence would not rest until they walked it fully. And so, as the first drops of rain touched the earth, he lifted his eyes to the veil once more, the hum of its pulse echoing through his chest, and understood with a clarity that both steadied and unsettled him. The silence had chosen to reveal itself, but what it wished to show them next would demand more than listening. It would demand surrender. The rain began softly, each drop sinking into the earth as though the sky itself wished to share in the silence. No thunder followed, no sharp winds, only a slow and steady fall that wrapped the gathering in a curtain of shimmering threads. The veil glowed more brightly against the grey wash of the storm, its pulse visible even through the mist that rose from the soaked ground. For the people, it felt less like weather and more like a message, a cleansing, a preparation. He stood with the little girl's hand still in his, her words echoing inside him. "It wants us to remember more." The simplicity of her voice carried a weight that neither time nor doubt could diminish. Around them, the people did not scatter as they once might have in the face of rain. They remained, their faces turned upward, their bodies still. They had begun to understand that even the storm had something to teach. Through the hush of water on earth, the hum of the veil grew stronger, no longer a quiet rhythm but a vibration that pressed into their bones. It was as though the silence was deepening, pulling them further inside itself, testing the edges of their surrender. For a moment he wondered if they would endure it, if the weight of what was being asked would be too much for them. Yet, as he looked at their faces, he saw no fear, only resolve. When the rain slowed, leaving only the scent of wet earth and the shimmer of droplets clinging to every surface, the young woman stepped forward. She had been quiet for days, her gaze often lingering on the veil with an intensity that suggested she carried questions too vast to speak aloud. Now her voice broke through the mist like a clear note. "If it asks us to remember more," she said, "then perhaps it also asks us to give more. Listening is not enough. It waits for something deeper." The words stirred the gathering, their truth undeniable.
Murmurs rippled through them, not of dissent, but of acknowledgement.
They had taken comfort in the silence, allowed it to settle their fears, to guide their thoughts, to heal the rift between them and the unknown. But comfort was never the end. The veil pulsed again, brighter, as though in answer, as though the silence itself approved. He felt the pull stronger than ever now, not toward crossing into the veil, but toward offering something unseen, something from within. The old man's journey had been one of departure, but this was different. This was about what remained behind. He closed his eyes and let his breath slow until the rhythm of the hum filled every corner of him.
And in that stillness,
he understood what the silence demanded, not fear, not worship, but surrender of the self that clung too tightly to control. When he opened his eyes, he saw the same realization dawning in the people. Some knelt in the damp grass, others lifted their palms as though ready to let go of burdens they had carried too long. The little girl stepped forward once more, and without hesitation she pressed her small hand against the glowing surface of the veil. This time it did not resist her, did not flare in warning. Instead, the light softened around her touch, flowing outward like ripples on water. A deep stillness fell, so profound that even the sound of dripping leaves seemed to vanish. In that silence they all felt it. The veil was not asking for sacrifice in the form of life, but in the form of truth. To step forward was to release the masks they wore, the weight of their illusions, the noise they carried inside. One by one, people began to approach. Some wept quietly as they touched the surface, others closed their eyes in serenity. Each contact seemed to leave a trace, a faint shimmer, as if the veil was collecting their surrenders like precious threads. The young woman turned to him then, her eyes bright with both fear and wonder.
"It is weaving us into itself," she whispered.
And he knew she was right. Every act of surrender became part of the silence, strengthening it, feeding it, binding them to something far greater than themselves. Yet with this understanding came unease.
He could feel the power of the silence deepening, pressing heavier with each offering.
The veil pulsed not only in response but in hunger, as though it had long awaited such nourishment. He could not tell whether it was an embrace or a consuming, whether they were being joined to something vast or slowly dissolved into it. Still the people did not falter.
Night returned, and with it the stars, their light broken into fragments by the moisture still hanging in the air.
The veil glowed so brightly now it seemed almost alive, casting shadows that moved without wind. Those who had touched it carried a change within them, lighter, clearer, their voices softer when they spoke, their eyes calmer when they looked upon one another. But he felt the other side of it too. In the quiet of his own heart, he sensed how close they were to losing themselves entirely. The silence was beautiful, yes, but beauty could also be dangerous. To surrender too much, to forget too fully, was to risk becoming nothing more than echoes. The veil did not warn them of this. It simply received what they gave. The choice was theirs. The little girl slept beside the veil that night, her breathing steady, her face serene, as if she belonged to both worlds at once. Watching her, he wondered if she already knew more than any of them, that surrender did not mean erasure, but transformation, that the silence was not an end, but a passage into something beyond words. He lay awake long after the others had drifted into slumber, listening to the hum that no longer came only from the veil, but from within their very gathering. The silence was no longer outside them. It was alive in their voices, their movements, their shared stillness. And in that moment he realized what unsettled him most. They had already begun to change, whether they wished to or not. By dawn, the air felt charged, the veil brighter than ever, its pulse faster, almost urgent. The young woman stood with him at its edge, her expression grave. "It is not finished," she said, her voice carrying the weight of certainty. "It asks for more, and soon it will show us what." He nodded, though unease coiled within him. The silence had given them peace, had shown them visions, had drawn them into unity. But now, as the hum deepened into a low vibration that seemed to shake the earth itself, he knew the next step would not be gentle. The silence was no longer simply waiting to be remembered. It was demanding to be lived. And in that demand lay the test that would either bind them to its truth or strip them of everything they had ever known. The ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet, not with violence but with a steady, resonant pulse, as though the earth itself had joined the hum of the veil. Morning light filtered weakly through clouds, yet it could not soften the intensity that now radiated from the shimmering surface. The people gathered once more, their faces pale not with fear, but with awe, their bodies instinctively leaning closer as though some hidden force pulled at their very cores. They had given much already, surrendered parts of themselves they had never thought they could release. And yet the veil asked for more. He felt it most keenly, standing there with the young woman and the child, as if every breath was weighed and measured, every thought quietly read by the silence. It was no longer simply around them, it was within them, threading through their veins like a second heartbeat. He wondered if this was the gift or the danger. Could something so vast be trusted with the fragile shape of their humanity? The child stirred first, her small hand brushing against his sleeve. Her eyes carried the glow of reflected light, but her voice was soft, steady. "It isn't hungry," she said, her words drifting into the still air like feathers. "It's only reminding us of what we promised." Those around them heard her and whispered her words as though they carried sacred weight. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps the veil did not demand but simply waited, a mirror held to their hearts. Yet the hum deepened once more, rolling through the valley like distant thunder, and doubt crept into his chest. Promises were one thing, giving themselves fully was another. The young woman stepped forward until she stood only a breath away from the veil. The glow painted her face in shifting shades, and her voice, though quiet, carried to every ear. If we are to belong to this silence, we must stop fearing it. It is not asking for our lives, but for the noise we cling to.
If we give it, we will not vanish. We will change. Her conviction steadied the people.
One by one, they drew closer again, as they had the night before. This time, however, there was no hesitation. They pressed their hands against the veil, some closing their eyes in surrender, others keeping them open as though braving the unknown. The surface shimmered with each touch, and where their palms lingered, patterns formed, delicate streams of light, twisting and weaving together like threads in a tapestry. He watched, breath held, as the veil slowly revealed what it had been creating all along. Within its depths, shapes began to emerge, faint silhouettes, glowing impressions of those who had already touched it. They were not whole reflections, but echoes, fragments of memory woven into the vast fabric of light. It was as if the silence was building a living archive, not of words or deeds, but of essence itself. The people gasped softly, not in terror, but in wonder. They saw themselves not as individuals, but as part of something far greater. Yet even as awe filled the air, a question pressed upon him. If too much of themselves was left within the veil, what would remain in the waking world? The child seemed to sense his unease. She tugged his hand gently and whispered, "You don't lose yourself, you just
stretch." Her smile was serene, as though she had glimpsed a truth beyond his grasp.
And perhaps she had. Children often saw what grown minds resisted. Still, he could not ignore the heaviness settling into him. When his turn came to touch the veil, he pressed his palm against it cautiously. The surface was warm, almost like skin, and beneath it pulsed a rhythm that matched his own heart. At once, he felt his memories ripple outward, not vanishing but flowing, as though they were being shared. He saw flashes of his past, laughter in fields, the quiet grief of parting, the first spark of wonder that had set him upon his path. All of it shimmered into the light. When he pulled his hand away, he felt lighter, as though a burden had been set down. Yet he also felt
less certain.
Had he given too much? Was he still himself? The silence offered no answer, only a steady, resonant hum that seemed to deepen with every surrender. That night, the veil grew brighter than ever before, so luminous it bathed the entire valley in soft radiance. The stars themselves seemed dim beside it. The people gathered in a circle, their faces aglow, their eyes reflecting both peace and unease. They could feel the threshold approaching, a point where the silence would no longer simply hum at the edges of their lives, but take root fully within them. The young woman looked to him then, her voice carrying the weight of what they all sensed. "It is becoming us," she said, "and we are becoming it. Soon there will be no line between." Her words hung in the air, heavy, yet strangely comforting. He realized then that the silence was not asking them to vanish. It was asking them to be more than what they had always been, to live as vessels of its stillness, to carry its peace into every corner of their days. But with that realization came the deeper question that would not leave him. Could they live such lives without losing the fragile,
imperfect humanity that made them who they were?
Could they carry silence without being consumed by it? As dawn approached once more, the veil pulsed with renewed urgency, its hum reverberating into the marrow of their bones. The people stood together, stronger than before, but also standing at the edge of a decision that could not be undone. The silence was no longer only around them. It was within them, shaping them, binding them, and soon it would decide whether they had given enough or whether it would ask for everything. The veil's glow lingered through the final night, softer now, yet deeper, as though it no longer needed to dazzle to be seen. It had woven itself into them, taken root quietly, patiently, until there was no longer a clear divide between what was human and what was silence. When the dawn came, it was not marked by brilliance, but by a gentle grey light that spread across the valley like a sigh. The people rose slowly, their bodies weary, yet unburdened, their voices hushed, as though instinct told them words might break something delicate. They stood together, and without needing to speak, they knew the moment had arrived. The hum was within them now, steady as breath, and for the first time it did not press or demand. It simply was an undercurrent binding them one to another. He felt it as he looked into the faces of those around him, the young woman whose gaze no longer carried uncertainty, the child whose small hand seemed to hold the weight of infinite knowing, the elders whose eyes reflected both memory and release. The silence had taken what it needed, and in return it had left them changed. He thought of the old man who had stepped into the veil long ago, his departure once shrouded in mystery. Now he understood. The man had not vanished. He had become part of this vast, patient quiet. Perhaps they all had, in some way. Not erased, but stretched into something larger, woven into the fabric of a presence that would linger long after their voices faded. As the day unfolded, the veil began to thin. Its once blinding glow softened into something almost transparent, like morning mist dissolving into the sky. The people did not panic, for they sensed this was not an ending, but a continuation. The silence no longer needed a veil to hold it. It lived within them now. Each breath carried it, each glance, each heartbeat. The child, sitting at the edge of the fading light, whispered words so faint he almost thought he imagined them.
"It doesn't leave," she said.
"It rests inside us, waiting to be remembered." And with those words, a great peace fell over them all, for they realized the silence was not a visitor, but a companion, one that would walk with them as long as they remembered to listen. In the days that followed, the valley changed. The grass grew taller, richer, as though nourished by more than rain. The rivers flowed clearer, the air carried a stillness that seemed to cradle every sound instead of smothering it. Life went on, but differently. Conversations were softer, laughter deeper, grief more patient. They carried the silence into everything, and in doing so they carried each other more gently. He often sat by the place where the veil had once stood, now only an open meadow beneath the stars. At night, when the world quieted, he could still feel the hum in his chest, faint but steady, and he would remember the light on their faces, the surrender of their burdens, the unity that had blossomed when they chose to let go. The young woman would sometimes join him, her presence calm, her silence eloquent. They did not need words to know what the other felt. The child, growing with each passing season, never lost her closeness to the silence. She seemed always to carry it most easily, as if she had never known a world without it. Her laughter was light but resonant, and when she spoke, even her simplest phrases felt like echoes of something greater. Watching her, he understood that the silence had not only asked for surrender, it had given them a legacy. Through her, and through all of them, it would continue. Years later, when time had worn his body into frailty, he returned to the meadow one final evening. The stars stretched endlessly above, and the air was cool, filled with the quiet he had long since learned to love. He lay back upon the grass and closed his eyes, and the hum was still there, gentle as ever. He thought of the veil of the child's hand in his, of the people who had stood together in wonder and fear, and he realized that none of it had truly passed. It was all still here, folded into the silence that embraced him now. And as his breathing slowed, he felt no fear. Only a release, as though he too was being stretched into something larger, carried into the same fabric, The old man and so many others had joined. He understood at last. The silence was not absence, but continuation, not erasure, but belonging. Somewhere in the meadow, the child, now grown, lifted her face to the stars. She smiled, and though she did not speak, the silence carried her voice to all who still listened. He is here. He has always been here. And so the story closed, not with an ending, but with an exhale, a gentle folding of one life into the endless breath of the silence. And with that, he stretched into the stars. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well.
Everything's going to be okay, man.